When I first started putting together the prototype for Greenlander, the crowding problem was a big issue for me. Enemies would just kind of run at the player, and since it's a one hit for both enemies and the player, the gameplay just wasn't that interesting. You'd either hit the enemy before they get to you, or they kill you. And I knew I needed some kind of interesting mechanic to sort of break up the flow of combat. So I came up with this idea for a kick. Here's some early gameplay of the kick mechanic. As you can see, it's really straightforward, but it does help the player kind of manage groups of enemies as they attack simultaneously. And it was sort of the seed for what would become the hook of Greenlander, the central mechanic. The next idea I had was for the kicked enemies to be kind of projectiles. So after you kick them, if you can line them up with another enemy, the enemy that gets hit by the kicked enemy also gets stunned. And that added a layer of, skill to the game where, depending on your spacing and the timing of the kick, you could take two enemies out of the fight for a second instead of just one. So the kicks in the game, now we have enemies running at you, you can kick them, they knock into each other and stun for a second. So melee combat is kind of starting to get fleshed out. But I also wanted ranged enemies, and ranged enemies kind of alter the flow of gameplay a little bit. So the way ranged enemies work in Greenlander is they have almost hit scan projectiles. They come out really fast, and you can't avoid them just by strafing or moving in a random direction. Well, technically you can, because sometimes the AI will miss you, but most of the time it doesn't work. So I needed some kind of a mechanic that would allow the player to avoid projectiles without having the only solution be run at the ranged enemy and kill them before they shoot an arrow at you. The idea I came up with is a really common mechanic in almost every action game, which is a dash. The dash had iframes on it, and if you timed it right, you could avoid arrows and kind of fix your spacing in the game. And I think this mechanic was really important, but it started to cause some problems. The dash was really fun and added a really frenetic and fast-paced energy to the game. But the problem with it was making the game a little bit too easy. You could just kind of dash around rooms, hitting enemies, and because there's very few recovery frames and almost no input delay in Greenlander, you were just too fast and strong. And a lot of the solutions to make the game more difficult would be to have enemies move faster and attack faster, and that makes the game feel a little bit more janky and unfair, and that wasn't a direction I really wanted to go in. So I knew I needed to kind of work on the mechanic a little bit more. The first solution I came up with was to put the dash on a cooldown. This definitely helped. You had to be a lot more strategic with how you used it. You had to be smarter with your pacing and your pathing in combat. But the problem with it was it started to encourage a kind of conflict between one of the core design philosophies behind Greenlander and how the game sort of played out when you sat down. And that's that I really wanted the game to encourage aggressive play. I wanted you to move between different enemies really quickly. I didn't want you to hide or run away. And with the dash being on a cooldown, now you want to dash and attack and then kind of back up a little bit, dash again, stuff like that. It had a more kind of traditional action gameplay to it, and it just wasn't fitting with my vision for the game. So then I had my eureka moment, kind of. I decided that in order to make it so that the player would move between enemies quickly and not take cover, I thought, what if I make it so that you have to kill enemies really quickly or you'll die? And that's where I came up with the idea for Blood Rage. Blood Rage is a single chargeable bar that you have, and it gets replenished every time you kill an enemy. The Blood Rage will decay over a very short window of time, so you have to use it quickly, and it's binary. You either have Blood Rage or you don't. It's not like an amount, so you don't consume 50 Blood Rage. You either have Blood Rage and consume it and go to 0, or you get it recharged. The amount of Blood Rage you have is just how long you have it for. Now the dash isn't on a cooldown, It's just limited to the last time you killed an enemy. And this started to make the game really interesting. You had to be very smart about which enemies you killed, in which order, and when you used your dash, and it was really starting to take the shape that I kind of envisioned when I started this project, but it still wasn't finished. So I can't remember exactly the number of iterations that I went through, but it was a lot. But finally I got to the version of the shield bash that's in the game, which was to take the parry mechanic or the blocking mechanic and just slap it onto the wind-up animation for the shield bash. So in this final version of the shield bash, all you do is hold down the dash button. As you're holding it down, the player kind of pulls his shield up. And while he's in this state, any incoming damage in the direction that you're facing gets blocked. So arrows get vaporized, any swinging attack gets parried, and the enemy that was attacking you gets stunned for a second. And then once you're dashing, you are also blocking incoming damage. But if you collide with an enemy in your path, you kind of pick them up, and they sit on your shield for a second. Now the final mechanic that is on the shield bash in its current iteration is what I call the pile drive. It's called pile driving in the game's code. So what pile driving is I mentioned the first enemy you hit with your dash, you kind of pick them up on your shield. Well, I started thinking, I was like, well, what happens if you're pushing this enemy and you hit a wall? I was like, maybe they should die. Like, instead of launching them, which is what you normally do, maybe they should just get squished against the wall since he's moving so fast. And so I worked on this for a while, I iterated on it, and I think it works really well. It's definitely very, very strong, and it made the mechanic really good, especially since you're probably wondering to yourself, wait, so if you immediately kill them while you're dashing, doesn't that just immediately recharge your blood rage? And I asked that question too. I was like, maybe I should make it so that you don't get blood rage for that, but unfortunately I have to be consistent. If you kill an enemy, you get blood rage, so yes, you can infinitely chain pile drives together. In the final version of the game, the actual combat encounters will have a little bit more space to them. And there will be certain enemies that you can't pile drive, like armored enemies or larger enemy types. So I don't think that it's strictly game breaking, and it's so much fun, I just cannot bring myself to take it out. And so here we are. This is the final version of the Shield Bash that's in the Greenlander demo. It's the killer app of Greenlander. It's really fun. There's still a lot more work to be done to it. There's a couple more ideas I want to play with. For example, I think it'd be cool if there were destructible walls in the game that you could break through with your shield bash, and so you'd have to kind of strategically decide, okay, am I going to kill an enemy? Am I going to try and take out an archer with this? Or do I want to maybe open up a new pathway and take out a stronger enemy that's going to end up in the arena in a couple seconds? I think that will be interesting. It'll take some time to sort of balance. Another mechanic I want to add to the shield bash is the axe bounce. So it's not in the demo right now, but it's a mechanic I'm currently working on. You're going to be able to throw your axe, and there's going to be like stone walls that have like an angle to them, and you can bounce the axe off of it and like snipe enemies if they're giving you trouble. And I thought an interesting idea to go off of that would be the axe, you bounce it and you get an angle where it's like coming back to you, and instead of catching it, you shield bash it, and that gives it like a bunch more acceleration, and so it goes through like 2 or 3 more enemies. It's going to be really fun. It's probably going to be too good, but I'll try and find a way to balance it. If you find the concept of Greenlander interesting and you'd like to support it, there is a Kickstarter live right now. There's lots of really cool limited tiers left. You can also grab just a copy of the game for $10. The final version of the game will be $15, so you get a little discount there. There's lots of cool limited tiers, like the Shieldmate of the Raven Feeder tier. You'll get to design an NPC that'll be in the game. We'll work together. I'll send you concept art. You'll help write the dialogue for them, kind of the backstory. Yeah, I think that tier will be really cool. So check that out. The link is in the description. If you'd like to try Greenlander, there is a very short demo on itch.io. I'll leave the link to that in the description as well. Thanks for watching.